Industrial war. Technology speeds the pace of slaughter. Guns fire faster. Trains rush men to the killing grounds. Cameras record their suffering. Communications quicken their rendezvous with death. This portrait is our first real glimpse of the face of the warrior. In 1854, this British cavalry officer was recorded by a device that would shape warfare as much as gunpowder. A peaceful device, the camera. This is no romantic picture. The camera would tell a grim story the world had never heard. Men like these were about to face the full force and horror of industrialized war in a tiny corner of the Russian Empire called the Crimea. In 1854, Russia already was an industrial power. Her factories produced giant cannon and howitzers like these at the fortress of Sebastopol. For centuries, the weapons men fought with were the product of ancient technology. At the time of the American and French revolutions, men had been fighting for 300 years with gunpowder, horses, and cold steel. The men who fought at Waterloo in the early 19th century would have recognized the weapons and tactics of the early 17th century. Waterloo was the end of an era. After the slaughter of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe enjoyed 4 decades of peace. But while Europe's armies rested, her factories forged ahead. When war broke out again, generals could draw on new technology. The train, the telegraph, the steamship. The Crimean War started when Russia attacked the ailing empire of Ottoman Turkey. Fearing Russian expansion, Britain and France sided with Turkey. In September 1854, the Allied army set sail for the Crimea, a peninsula of the Ukraine. Troops traveled by steamship. This new means of transport was so reliable that huge military operations could now be launched from afar to a precise plan and timetable. Steam power landed a vast stockpile of stores and ammunition exactly where and when they were needed. The French and British armies poured ashore. Their first objective was the Russian naval base of Sebastopol. As the Allies set out, a Russian army blocked their way along the rocky heights overlooking the Alma River. For all their industrial strength, at the Battle of Alma the Russians were armed with muskets much like the ones used by their grandfathers against Napoleon. Their effective range was no more than 200 yards, less than the longbows used by English archers 5 centuries before. The British and French had a new weapon, the rifle and Minié bullet. The Minié bullet was hollow at the base. It expanded into the grooved gun barrel, harnessing the full power of the explosion and leaving the muzzle of the rifle with a powerful spin. It had a killing range of 500 yards, nearly 3 times the lethal distance of the Russian muskets. Leo Tolstoy, Russian author of War and Peace, fought as a young artillery officer at the Battle of the Alma. He described the impact of the Allied rifle fire.
You have only managed to climb a little way when bullets begin to hum around you. All around you seem to hear the various sounds that bullets make, from the ones that hum like bees to the ones that whistle rapidly by, or twang with a noise like a plucked string. It shakes you to the core and inspires you with a profound sense of dread.
With Minié bullets, the British slaughtered the massed columns of Russians before Tolstoy and his men could even see them. The Battle of the Alma was a turning point in the history of war. The Minié bullet, a small step in the science of ballistics, made artillerymen like the young Tolstoy horribly vulnerable to infantry fire. On the open field of battle, artillery's dominance was over. Field guns of the future would have to dig in out of sight. The British and French advanced in triumph. Near the port of Balaclava, the Russians turned to fight again. At Balaclava, the British commander ordered a cavalry unit to capture a battery of Russian guns. The unit was the Light Brigade. The orders they received were unclear. The Light Brigade charged straight down a narrow, artillery-lined valley toward the guns at the far end. For a whole mile, the British cavalrymen ran a gauntlet of cannon fire. The Light Brigade took the Russian guns, but couldn't hold them. They were forced to retreat back down the Valley of Death. Of 673 cavalrymen, 247 were killed. Minié bullets and steamships gave the Allies the upper hand, but at Balaclava, tactics had not caught up with technology. The day of the cavalry charge was already over before Balaclava. The Light Brigade had to perish to prove it. All over the Crimea, peacetime inventions were finding wartime uses. French officers storming the Russian fortress of Malakoff were the first to use watches accurate enough to be synchronized before the attack, standard practice on the battlefield ever since. New communications technology was changing war in unexpected ways. William Howard Russell, the world's first war correspondent, reported on the Crimean War for the influential London Times. Russell arrived in the Crimea full of enthusiasm for the war. But as winter set in and he witnessed the neglect of wounded soldiers, Russell's enthusiasm turned to anger.
The dead, laid out as they died, were lying side by side with the living. The stench was appalling. For all I could observe, these men died without the least effort to save them.
From the commanding general down, the regimental colonels, they simply didn't care. They weren't interested. It was an army that basically was willing to sacrifice its soldiers because they fundamentally didn't seem to care.
British public opinion was outraged. Despite efforts by the military to gag him, Russell's reports brought down the British government. They also inspired a British woman to go to the Crimea. Her influence on military medical care was simple and revolutionary. Florence Nightingale.
Her great contribution in the Crimea was to clean up the hospital that she was working in at Scutari, markedly reduce the death rate by nursing care, by better diet, by simple cleanliness. When Miss Nightingale came home, she said, "I stand at the altar of those murdered men, and while I live, I shall defend their cause." And she did.
When the war was over, Florence Nightingale's work led to the foundation of the Army Medical School, a fitting tribute. The Crimean War was the first to be influenced by the press. The soldiers portrayed in Roger Fenton's pioneering photos were seen only by a privileged few, but the words of the journalists got through. From now on, the photographer and the reporter would be fixtures on the battlefield. Looking over their shoulder would be public opinion. July 1861, the American Civil War. For the first time in history, trains bring men to the battlefield. These aren't battle-hardened professionals. They're young, brash, undisciplined. They were not the professionals of a regular European army, but the volunteer citizens of a brave new world, determined to fight for their vision of America. The first battle in that war came to be known as the Battle of Bull Run. Both sides were passionate about their cause, but the outcome would depend on which side combined new technology with war-winning strategy. The battle lines of the American Civil War were drawn between North and South. The North, under Abraham Lincoln, was committed to the Union of American States. The 11 Southern states, under Jefferson Davis, had left the Union to protect slavery, the basis of their economy. Both sides expected quick victory. Lincoln's Union troops were asked to enlist for only 90 days. These 90-day volunteers were eager to fight the first battle of the war, believing it would be the last. In July 1861, General Irvin McDowell led a Union army into the South. McDowell himself had never commanded more than 12 men in the field. Now he led 38,000. McDowell advanced on the railway junction at Manassas, the main supply route to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Meanwhile, 22,000 Confederate troops already were underway. Their commander was General Pierre Beauregard. Beauregard wanted his troops to arrive well rested and ready to fight. Rail was the key. At the Battle of Manassas, Beauregard's men arrived by train. McDowell didn't have a railway to use. It was over 30 miles from Washington to Manassas, and the Union troops had to march all the way under a blistering sun. Lieutenant George W. Bicknell of the 5th Maine Infantry recalls that march.
Our water was nearly gone, and during that whole run of some 6 or 7 miles, we were not once allowed to replenish our canteens. Unaccustomed to such severe marches, suffering intensely from thirst and heat, our thinning ranks began to show the effects of overexertion. Men seemed to fall in squads by the roadside, some sunstruck, some bleeding at nose, mouth, ears, while others were exhausted to such a degree that the threatening muzzle of the officer's pistol failed to induce them a step further.
The day of the battle, another army set out from Washington. Congressmen and their wives, businessmen, the well-to-do of the Union capital, headed toward Manassas with picnics and parasols to watch the fight. These tourists thought the war would be over by dinner time. They went hoping for a spectacle. They got more than they expected. At 5:30 on the morning of July 21st, 1861, the roar of a 30-pound cannon broke the morning calm. The Battle of Bull Run had begun. McDowell ordered his march-weary Union troops to mount a diversionary attack where the Turnpike Road crossed Bull Run Creek. The maneuver paid off. A large body of Confederates was lured to the bridge. McDowell launched his main attack at Matthews Hill. The thin Confederate line buckled. Only the section under Brigadier General Thomas Jackson stood firm. The cry went up, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." Stonewall Jackson held his ground, but elsewhere the Southerners were in retreat. The North scented victory. Lieutenant Josiah Flavel of the 57th New York Infantry describes the scene.
The enemy having disappeared, some of us concluded to walk over the battlefield, see how it looked, and pick up some souvenir of the fight. What a horrible sight it was. Here a man grasping his musket firmly in his hands, stone dead. Several with distorted features, all of them horribly dirty. Many were wounded, some with legs shot off, others with arms gone. All of them, in fact, so badly wounded that they could not drag themselves away.
Such were the sights of industrial war.
Suddenly, a whole volley of musket balls whizzed about us. One of them striking my companion, who dropped to the ground as though he had been killed.
General Beauregard telegraphed for reinforcements. They came quickly by train. Confederates flooded onto the battlefield. The train had turned the tide in favor of the South. The exhausted Union troops were overwhelmed. McDowell's Union Army fled the battlefield in disorder. The sightseers also retreated in panic. War had not been the picnic they hoped for. Merging with the Union troops, they blocked bridges and jammed roadways. In a single afternoon, 5,000 young American men lay dead or dying along Bull Run Creek. The Union Army's objective at Manassas was the railroad. Instead, it became the decisive weapon used against them by the Confederates, and the telegraph was that weapon's trigger. A year later, the two sides would be back, fighting again over the same ground. It was going to be a long war. August 1862, the Second Battle of Bull Run. 24,000 casualties in 2 days. September 1862, the Battle of Antietam. 26,000 losses, the single bloodiest day in America's history. The slaughter grows, yet neither side is ready to quit. Under Robert E. Lee, the Confederates defeat one Union army after another. But the North is getting reinforcements. Industry is mobilizing. One year into the American Civil War, tens of thousands lay dead. But leaders on both sides could still count on popular support. Americans were prepared to die for what they believed in. The North, with a total population of 25 million, had 2 million men under arms. The South, with a population of only 9 million, of whom a third were slaves, had an army of 1 million. This was mobilization on a vast scale. European observers were impressed. One was writer and philosopher Karl Marx.
From whatever standpoint one regards it, the American Civil War presents a spectacle without parallel in the annals of military history. The vast extent of the disputed territory, the far-flung front lines of operation, the numerical strength of the hostile armies, the fabulous cost of these armies, and the tactical and strategical principles in accordance with which the war is waged are all new in the eyes of the European onlooker.
With both sides determined to fight to the last, the Civil War turned into a grinding war of attrition. It was a war made bloodier by both sides having the rifled weapons and long-range Minié bullets the British and French had used in the Crimea. Infantry and artillery had no choice but to take cover. By 1864, both sides had learned how to dig in. As the war dragged on, trenches were dug deeper so supply and evacuation could take place under cover. Here, half a century early, was a chilling foretaste of the First World War, where only a bloody full frontal attack or blanket artillery fire could break the deadlock. A war in which going over the top was suicide.
When the armies locked horns in big battles, as they had done right from the beginning at First Bull Run, they did fight with extraordinary ferocity. Some bloodlust seems to have gripped those armies, so that they pitched in with extraordinary aggressiveness.
Modern war needed modern medical care. Historian Robert Joy has studied how medicine responded to industrial warfare.
One of the essences of management of mass casualties is to have structure, to have doctrine, to have system. When the Union Army went to war, it didn't have any of that in its medical department. It was still operating as if it were out in the frontier.
Military medicine had to change. Major John Letterman of the Union Army Medical Corps led the way. Letterman developed a system for quickly assessing casualties, classifying them as injured, ill, dead, or dying, with field procedures for each. The system was simple, but it worked. Care was continuous from the battlefield to recovery or death. With Letterman's system, doctors saved wounded men who would have died on the battlefields of the past. Early plastic surgeons repaired faces shattered by war. The camera recorded their efforts. The significance of the camera as an instrument of record was seized upon by a young society photographer, Matthew Brady. Brady took photography out of the studio and onto the battlefield. Here was the first serious photojournalist. Brady equipped 20 photographers and used a fleet of mobile darkrooms to record the conflict. His legacy is far greater than the archive he left behind. Brady inspired the war photographers of the future. For 100 years, war photographers have changed the way we think of war. All owe their inspiration to Brady. In 1862, Karl Marx predicted how the war would end with uncanny accuracy.
The sole route that, after the complete conquest of Tennessee by the Union, connects the two sections of the slave state goes through Georgia. This proves that Georgia is the key to the South.
It was Union General William Tecumseh Sherman who would make Georgia howl.
Sherman's march from Atlanta to the sea, the campaign through Georgia, was a deliberate campaign of terror. It was to take away the livelihood of the heartland of the South. Sherman was a psychological warrior. He thought that the purpose of war was to strike at the enemy's will to fight.
In September 1864, Sherman took Atlanta, the capital of Georgia. Major James A. Connolly of the 23rd Illinois recalls the night Sherman entered the city.
Drunken soldiers on foot and on horseback raced up and down the streets, while the buildings on either side were solid sheets of flame. The night for miles around was bright as midday. The city of Atlanta was one mass of flame, and the morrow must find it a mass of ruins.
Sherman's campaign to break the South by a brutal assault on the civilian population gave the world another chilling glimpse of the future: total warfare. A kind of warfare that made everything and everyone a target and created a new kind of victim: the refugee. The North's victory in 1865 came at huge cost to the nation. 600,000 lay dead. The death toll was higher than American losses in 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam, put together. Industrial war in America had lasted 4 bloody years. The next industrial war in Europe would be over in 7 weeks. (1866) Prussia marches against Austria. Prussian industry is booming, and with it her military power. In the coming battle with Austria, the map of Europe will be redrawn. The Prussian army sent observers to the American Civil War. They saw the impact of railways, telegraph, and modern rifles on the battlefield. The Prussians had no time for a long war of attrition. The war they wanted was short, clean, and cheap. Prussia's Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, dreamed of uniting German-speaking people in a single state. He would do it with a series of quick, decisive wars. Bismarck turned to his Chief of General Staff, Helmut von Moltke. Moltke was a product of the Kriegsakademie, the world's first military staff college. He saw the impact of the train on the American Civil War. Trains, he said, would prove more valuable in future wars than fortresses. By 1860, Prussia had 3,500 miles of strategically positioned state-owned track to transport the armies that would unite Germany. Moltke bought railway stock and grew rich. The value of railways wasn't the only lesson the Prussians learned in America. As they moved into Austria, they extended their telegraph network deep into enemy territory, often at great risk. With the railway and telegraph, commanders hundreds of miles from a war zone could move their armies like chess pieces. Prussian staff headquarters in Berlin made history by doing just that. In late summer 1866, Prussia's army moved south toward Austria. Fresh from their rail journey, directly commanded from Berlin, the Prussian army pursued the Austrians into what is now the Czech Republic. On July 3, 1866, in the hills just north of Königgrätz, the Austrians turned to fight. Both sides were evenly matched except for one detail, the Prussian needle gun. It was fired by a needle-like pin which pierced a percussion cap in the center of a paper cartridge. Most importantly, it was quickly loaded from the breech, not the muzzle. The Prussians could reload and fire 3 to 4 times quicker than the Austrians, and could do so lying down. The Austrians still used slow, unreliable muzzle loaders. The Austrian commander knew about the Prussian rifles and ordered his subordinates not to attack. His senior officers chose to ignore the command and charged headlong into battle. They were to pay a fearsome price. At the western edge of the battlefield, a firefight flared up in dense woodland known as Zwip Woods. It was in these woods that the battle was to turn. A young officer, Emil von Lessel, recalls,
"On the other side of the wood, a far-reaching plateau was visible, and on this stood the Austrian gun batteries. There was an unholy din. We occupied the southern edge of the Zwip Wood. I ran about 150 paces to the south to a ditch into which we threw ourselves. Me too, of course, although at that time it was not yet customary for an officer to lie down.
the Austrians committed 49 battalions to the Zwick Woods. 28 vanished without trace. It was a massacre. From a prone position, the Prussians fired relentlessly on their hapless enemy. The Austrians stood in a hail of bullets, fumbling with their muskets. The breech-loading needle guns cut them down. In a Czech forest, the needle gun had shifted Europe's center of gravity. Bled dry by the slaughter, the Austrians collapsed. The battle was lost. 40,000 Austrians were dead or wounded, 20,000 taken prisoner. For the once mighty Austrians, Königgrätz was the beginning of the end. In the 7-week campaign waged by Moltke, Bismarck's Prussia had gained 5 million new citizens and tens of thousands of square miles for the new Germany. Prussia was now a near-perfect war machine. Its next target would be France. July 1870. France is fighting Prussia. As the European superpowers square off, murderous new weapons are changing the face of war. As soldiers take cover, war moves off the battlefield and into towns and villages. For decades, France had kept an eye on Prussian ambitions. Napoleon III decided the best form of defense was offense. In 1870, he attacked Prussia. Again, the railway would play a crucial role in war. But possessing railways was one thing. Using them efficiently was another. Instead of dispatching troops straight to the front, the French sent them to regional depots.
The reservists were wandering all over France looking for their regiments while their regiments were at the front. It took a long time for the army to concentrate the forces it had available. The forces were anyhow inferior in number to those of the Prussians. There was simply bad command, bad management. The staff didn't know, for example, how to run the railway system properly. And even when in contact with the enemy, the armies themselves were worse handled than the German armies.
Only 16 days after the outbreak of war, 400,000 Prussian troops had reached the front. 2 days later, 1.25 million, a feat of mobilization unmatched even in World War I.
The French system was far more rigid, far more centralized, and unless you got orders, you didn't do anything. And that, I think, was the reason why the Prussians were able to bring superior numbers to bear at decisive points on the battlefield, and the French weren't.
The Prussian war machine rolled west toward Paris. In 1 month, the Prussians would march halfway across France, but first they would pay a heavy price. With both sides using the most advanced weapons of the industrial age, there were bitter battles at the frontier. At Raisonneville in 1 day, the French lost 16,000 men, the Prussians 17,000. At Gravelotte-Saint-Privat, 8,000 Prussian guardsmen fell in 20 minutes. Total casualties at Gravelotte were 13,000 French and 20,000 Prussians. The French were killing the invaders at a horrific rate, but still the Prussians advanced. This photograph of French and Prussian soldiers at Sedan may be the first to show troops under fire. It is a remarkable picture by any standards. But most remarkable is, even with the battle raging, the soldiers seem more interested in the camera than their own safety. At Sedan, France was defeated. Effectively, the war was over. But Paris would not surrender. Bismarck ringed the city with artillery. It was a siege. Over 4 months, Prussian artillery bombarded Paris. In the end, the Parisians were starved out. On January 18, 1871, at the magnificent Palace of Versailles, a German empire under Wilhelm I was declared. In less than 50 years, the armies of Bismarck and Moltke made Germany the greatest land power in Europe. With $1 billion in reparations from France, the Germans built modern Berlin, a triumphant new capital for the new Germany, studded with monuments to its military glory. But more than the new Berlin was founded by the war settlement with France. The French had not just lost $1 billion at the end of the war. Germany also took the border provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. The French burned for revenge. For now, Germany was satisfied. Europe would enjoy 4 decades of peace. 4 decades for industry to manufacture bigger and better ways of killing. Four decades for science and engineering to take war into the sky.